Do you believe trauma runs in families like a pattern or breaks with you?
When I tell you that the text came out of nowhere, I mean it felt like one of those moments where you stare at your phone for a full minute, trying to figure out if you're even reading the words correctly, because surely you must be missing some context. Emily's message wasn't long, it wasn't even friendly, it was just a single paragraph that basically said, "Hey, I wanted to let you know there's no room for you at the wedding. We're really tight on space and budget, but I hope you understand." No explanation beyond that. No attempt to soften it, not even a phone call, just a little digital shove that immediately set off this mix of shock, hurt, and, strangely, a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For a few seconds, I was actually too stunned to react, because after everything I'd done for her over the past decade, it was impossible to believe she would decide I didn't even deserve a chair at her so-called biggest day of her life. At first, I went through the motions of trying to rationalize it. Maybe there really was some kind of issue with the venue. Maybe the guest list had exploded and they were scrambling. Maybe her fiancé's family had insisted on bringing 20 extra people. But the longer I looked at that cold little message, the more obvious it became that if space was really the problem, there were 100 ways she could have handled it that didn't involve excluding her only sister without warning. And what made it worse was that she'd sent it like she was checking something off a to-do list, as if my reaction was irrelevant. I typed out a dozen different responses. Some of them were sarcastic, some were confrontational, and one was just me asking her flat out if she was serious. But then I stopped. I deleted every draft and just sent back a short reply that said, "I understand. I'll send my regrets." That was it. No questions, no begging for details, no offering to help make it work. Because in that moment, something clicked for me. I realized that for years I had been bending over backwards to keep her comfortable, to patch up the holes in her life that she dug herself into, to make sure she never hit bottom. And she had gotten so used to it that she could treat me like an optional extra in her own family. What she didn't know, and what I didn't tell her, was that my help wasn't just nice to have. It was the glue holding her life together. I had been covering the last few hundred on her rent every month when her paycheck didn't stretch far enough, paying off chunks of her credit card balance when the interest started snowballing, and even spotting her money for things she swore she'd pay back but never did. And I never made a big deal about it, because I figured that's what family does, you help each other when you can. But when she sent that message, it was like a switch flipped in my head, and I suddenly saw every one of those small favors for what they really were, a lifeline she'd started to take for granted. I didn't confront her because I didn't need to. I didn't demand an apology, because I wasn't interested in some half-hearted excuse about venues or headcounts. What I did instead was start quietly preparing for what I knew was going to happen next. I didn't think she would notice the absence of my support right away. Emily has this confidence about her spending that makes her believe money will just work itself out somehow, but I knew there would come a moment, probably sooner than she expected, when the reality would hit her like a wall. The part that stung the most wasn't even being cut from the guest list. It was realizing that she had so little respect for me that she thought I'd swallow the insult and keep operating like nothing happened. She probably pictured me sending her a wedding gift, maybe even slipping a check into the card, and sitting at home while she posed for photos with her perfect bridal party. And the fact that she assumed I'd play along told me everything I needed to know about how she saw me: reliable, predictable, and willing to accept whatever scraps of consideration she felt like offering. Well, she was about to find out that I could be unpredictable when I wanted to be. I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to block her number. I just had to stop being the safety net she thought would always be there. I already knew the timing, the end of the month, when the rent and the last vendor payments for her wedding were due. All I had to do was hold my ground, smile if she asked how I was doing, and let her figure out what life looked like without me smoothing over the cracks. And the thing is, I didn't even feel guilty. Not for 1 second. Because in my mind, this wasn't revenge, at least not yet. This was just giving her exactly what she said she wanted, even if she didn't say it in those exact words. No room for me at the wedding? Fine. Then maybe there's no room in my budget for her anymore. I hit send on that polite little "I understand" text, put my phone down, and didn't give her the satisfaction of a single follow-up question. But in my head, I was already making a list, not of ways to hurt her, but of all the invisible ways I'd been holding her up that she was about to lose. And I'll be honest, the thought of her realizing it on her own, that was the first time in a long while I'd actually looked forward to hearing from her. The day after I sent the polite little message that I understood and would send my regrets, I woke up to a string of notifications that had nothing to do with Emily yet somehow felt connected to her anyway. Because that is how it works when you have spent years weaving your routines around someone else's emergencies. You start to hear every buzz through the filter of what she might need next, and I was halfway through making coffee when my friend Kelsey called and, without even saying hello, blurted that I should probably know what Emily had been saying about me to her bridesmaids, which is how I learned that this whole no-room explanation wasn't about chairs or plates or fire codes. It was about Emily deciding that I bring drama and make things about myself and that she didn't want any negative energy near her big day. I stood there with the phone on speaker and listened while Kelsey, who hates conflict and speaks in careful little circles when she is nervous, apologized for telling me something she knew would hurt, then rushed to add that she didn't even agree with Emily, but that apparently Emily had framed it as a boundary, like she was being healthy and empowered by choosing a stress-free environment, and I realized in a slow, steady way that I wasn't even surprised, because if you've ever spent years being the responsible one, the one who shows up with receipts and calendars and reality checks, you know that it only takes one person with a talent for spinning stories to make you look like the killjoy. And suddenly your basic adult behavior reads like control to people who prefer chaos. I thanked Kelsey and told her I was fine, which was not entirely true, but what was more true is that something practical had clicked into place for me. Because if Emily had the nerve to paint me as a problem while leaning on my money like a hidden brace behind a stage set, then the only reasonable response was to step back and let the set stand on its own. So I sat down at my laptop and opened the list I kept for tax season, the one where I track transfers and expenses so I can tell my accountant what all those little monthly drips were for, and I scrolled through line after line with her name on it and felt a kind of calm I hadn't felt in a long time. There was the scheduled transfer on the first of the month that patched the rent gap she never admitted to the landlord. There was the autopay I set up for her phone line when she temporarily joined my family plan and then never left. There was the subscription I had covered for her design app because she swore she would use it to freelance and build a portfolio that never quite materialized. There was the card on which she had an authorized user profile that I kept only because it gave her the airline miles she said would cover the honeymoon upgrade if she ever got around to booking it. There were the 2 or 3 random cash apps where I had little recurring reminders like a drip irrigation system keeping someone else's plant alive. And as I stared at it all, the picture finally looked honest. I started with the easy things, the ones that wouldn't cause any irreversible harm but would immediately communicate the new reality, and I canceled the scheduled rent transfer, then removed her as an authorized user on the card because I am not a bank. And if she wanted miles, she could earn them herself. Then I logged into the phone account and separated my line from hers by scheduling a number transfer for the end of the week with a clear note that the account would continue under my name only and that any additional lines would need to be set up by their users, which meant she would have to qualify and put down a deposit like an adult. And I know that sounds petty, but it was not about punishment. It was about ending a pattern that turned me into the permanent backstop for someone who had no incentive to change. I debated the design app, because that one had always felt like an investment in her growth, but then I remembered the afternoon she laughed about borrowing my login to build wedding signage after she had told one of her friends that I bring drama and should be kept out of the pictures, and it was like a switch flipped and I canceled that one too. Sending the courtesy email to myself that said the plan would expire at the end of the billing cycle, because I am not cruel and I am not trying to torture work, I am simply putting the cost where it belongs. It is funny how quickly the quiet accumulates once you stop explaining yourself, because I did not send a manifesto, I did not pick a fight, I did not write a single accusatory paragraph. I just let the systems do what systems do when you turn off the flow, and by late afternoon my phone vibrated with a message from Emily that could have passed for friendly if you didn't know the tone. The one where she asks if I happen to forget the rent transfer because the timing is tight and she is juggling wedding week chaos, and I stared at it for a long moment and felt the old instinct rise. The one that says fix it right now so you don't have to deal with the fallout later. And then I let that instinct pass and I replied that I thought it made sense to simplify things since she is building her new life and has new priorities, and that I assumed she would want everything clean and independent so she could start fresh without my support tethered to her bills. She did not like that, not one bit, and the next bubble came faster and sharper, with a line about how she never asked me to help in the first place, and how I always make things transactional, and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was the oldest trick in the book, the way people rewrite history when the free ride slows down, and I typed that I was happy to honor the boundary she set with the wedding because it clarified things for me, and that going forward I would not be involved in her finances or planning, and then I wished her a peaceful week and said I was rooting for her to have the day she wanted, which was the most honest thing I could write. I put my phone face down and I felt this steady hum of relief under the leftover hurt, because the decision was simple and I had made it without a scene, and all that was left now was to watch what happened when she had to stand on her own, and maybe that sounds cold. But sometimes the kindest truth you can give someone who has turned you into an ATM with feelings is the chance to find out what they can actually carry without you. An hour later, Kelsey sent me a screenshot from the group chat where Emily was scrambling for a makeup artist who would work for a discount and asking if anyone had a spare hotel points code for the honeymoon, and there it was. The first little tremor in a structure that had been held together by assumptions, and I did not gloat and I did not smirk. I just closed my messages and opened my budgeting app and deleted every reminder with Emily's name on it, because the switch had been flipped and there was no going back. That night, as I turned off the light, my phone buzzed again with a short, clipped line from Emily that said we needed to talk first thing in the morning, and I stared at the screen and thought, yes, we do, but not in the way you think. Because the conversation is no longer about what I will do for you, it is about what I will no longer do, and how you will handle that when the rent hits and the vendors want their money and your phone stops being free on my plan, and with that I set the phone on silent, rolled over, and let the quiet do its work, knowing that the real message had already been delivered without a word. The call she demanded first thing in the morning started with that tight voice she uses when she is pretending to be calm and civilized while also implying that I have created an emergency out of thin air, and she went straight into logistics without a hello, telling me the rent would be pulled on the first business day, and the florist needed a balance before the end of the week, and the venue had a final invoice sitting in her inbox that made her want to throw up, and she asked if I had paused my help by mistake because she understood that I was busy, which was a funny way to describe me choosing not to bankroll someone who had just announced there was no place for me at her wedding. I let her talk, because letting her talk has always told me more than asking questions, and when she ran out of steam I said, in the flattest, kindest voice I could manage, that I had respected the boundary she set with the wedding and decided it made sense to clear our finances too, since she was starting a new life and should not have to depend on me anymore, and I could hear the silence on her end expand into something prickly and hot. She tried 2 different doors before the third one slammed, which is how it always goes with her. First, she went polite, saying she appreciated everything I had done and only needed a little help until the checks cleared. Then she tried guilt, reminding me that family shows up and that she would do the same for me, which we both knew had never happened even once, and then, when neither of those worked, she went for the jab, saying that money had made me controlling and that I loved to keep people obligated, and I surprised both of us by laughing, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because the idea that I had ever controlled her was so upside down that it broke something open in me. And I told her that what she called control was me refusing to pay for the privilege of being insulted. She hung up on me after that, which was a relief, because I did not want to keep repeating the words that felt more like a door locking than an argument. What she did not know yet was that the switch off was not a single action, but a sequence I had already arranged with the patience of someone who has been project managing other people's chaos for years and finally gets to use those skills for herself. The number transfer on the phone plan was set to finalize on Friday, which meant she had several days to walk into a store and set up her own account before anything cut off. The authorized user removal had already gone through, which meant the card she liked to wave at vendors would now quietly decline instead of routing to me. The autopay for her design app would sunset at the end of the cycle, which gave her a month to download files and decide what she wanted to keep, and the rent transfer. The big one, the one she counted on like a tide, had already been cancelled before our call, which meant her account would come up short unless she found the money somewhere else. I will admit I timed it, not to be cruel but to be effective, because there is no lesson in a cushion, and I was done patting the ground. I stayed outwardly cheerful when she sent a follow-up text about the misunderstanding, and I replied that there was none, and I wished her an easy week and told her I trusted she would handle everything. And then I did something that felt small, but turned out to be significant. I logged into the hotel rewards portal where the miles from my card lived and moved them into my personal travel bank, because she had been spinning a story to her friends about a complimentary upgrade she had scored with her savvy, and I was not going to sit quietly while she translated my years of careful budgeting into a brag. I did not touch anything of hers. I simply stopped letting her treat my work like her windfall. By midweek, the messages shifted from brisk to messy, the way they do when a person starts to realize that a safety net has not materialized and there is no way to make a bounced payment sound like a casual hiccup. She wrote that the rent hit and her fiancé Tyler was furious because he had promised his parents everything was under control, and that the florist was suddenly being dramatic about a balance and threatening to release the date if payment did not land by close of business, and that she could not believe I would choose this week, of all weeks, to make a point. I did not tell her that the point chose itself the moment she typed that there was no room for me. I kept it simple and repeated that I was stepping back from all financial involvement and wished her luck. My parents entered the scene right on schedule, calling me with voices that tried to sound neutral and failed, telling me that this was not the time to pick at old wounds, and that I should please cover the rent just this once so the landlord would not call them. Which was news to me, because apparently Emily had listed our father as an emergency contact without telling anyone, and the thought that he could be dragged into late notices made my jaw clench. I asked them if they remembered who covered the security deposit when Emily moved in, and there was a pause long enough to answer the question, and I told them I loved them and would not be writing any checks, not now and not later, because I was done sponsoring someone who treated me like an optional extra. My mother sniffed that I was punishing Emily for setting a boundary, and I said that I was honoring it, which was true in a way that made me both sad and steady. Kelsey kept me updated without turning it into gossip, sending a screenshot of Emily in the bridesmaid chat asking if anyone knew a photographer who would trade a discount for exposure, which told me exactly how strapped she was. And then another message where Emily asked if someone had a spare family plan slot temporary, which made me smile in spite of myself, because 5 minutes earlier the number transfer had finalized and my account was finally just mine. I ordered takeout and watched an old show while my phone kept buzzing, and I refused to pick it up, because picking it up had never brought me anything except the privilege of solving problems I did not create. Late that night, Tyler called me from his number, which he had never done before, and he tried the reasonable fiancé approach, saying he understood there were complicated feelings between sisters and that weddings bring out the worst in everyone. And if I could float them just 1 month, he would personally make sure it was paid back after the honeymoon, and I told him I appreciated the respectful tone and that I wished them a smooth week, but that I would not be involved, and he was quiet for a moment and then said that Emily had told him I insisted on being in the wedding party and made things difficult, and I almost choked, because the revisionism was moving faster than I expected. I told him the truth in one sentence, which was that Emily uninvited me and called it a boundary, and that my boundary now was money, and he exhaled like a balloon losing air and muttered that he did not know what to say. The next morning, a notification popped up from my bank about a decline charge attempt from a vendor I did not recognize, likely a final effort to run the old card on file, and I stared at it and felt that strange calm again. Because nothing was out of order, nothing was cruel, nothing was dramatic. It was simply life returning to its right size. I made myself coffee and sat down to answer emails, and that is when Emily's name lit up my screen with a message that made my stomach drop in that old familiar way. Because it said there had been a mistake with the venue contract and something big was about to fall through unless a payment posted by noon, and she added a single line that did not sound like her at all. If you care about me at all, please pick up. When I finally answered, I did it because the message sounded less like her usual dramatics and more like a person who had just watched a chair leg snap. And before she could launch into the speech she had rehearsed, I told her to breathe and tell me clearly what was happening. Which is how I learned that the venue contract had a clause she never really read that required a final payment by noon or the date would be released without appeal, and that her plan had been to cover it with the card she used when she was an authorized user and then square up with me later, which obviously was not possible anymore, and suddenly the silence between us wasn't posturing or attitude. It was the sound of her realizing her story about me being the difficult sister was about to collide with a very real invoice that didn't care about anyone's version of events. She tried to sell me a compromise first, the one where I cover the payment, and she promises a repayment plan after the honeymoon, and when I said no, she went straight into the speech about how this would humiliate her with Tyler's family and make it look like they couldn't handle basic planning, and that if I cared about our relationship I wouldn't do this to her, and I said, in a steady voice I barely recognized as mine, that I wasn't doing anything to her. I was simply refusing to fund a wedding I was not welcome to attend. I could hear her scrambling for something that would land, so I spared both of us the performance and told her I was going to send her 3 things and then step away, and I followed through in less than 5 minutes. Because this part 1 had prepared for like a person who finally understands that boundaries only hold when they are written down and enforced. The first was a short email to the landlord removing our father as an emergency contact and replacing it with Emily's own information, written in plain language so there would be no confusion about who would be notified if the rent was late again. And I CC'd Emily so she couldn't pretend she had missed it. The second was a tidy ledger I had kept for years, nothing dramatic, just dates and categories and amounts with a summary line at the end. And I sent it to my parents and to Emily in a single message that said I would no longer be supporting her finances in any way and that any stories suggesting otherwise were not accurate. The third was a brief note to Tyler that I sent from my personal email, respectful and uncluttered, stating that I wished them well and that I wanted to clear any misunderstandings by confirming that I had been asked not to attend the wedding, that I had stepped back from all funding because of that decision, and that any financial gaps they were experiencing were not caused by delays on my end. It was not a blast. It was not a takedown. It was the administrative version of turning on the lights so everyone could see where the furniture actually was. The responses landed in waves that told their own story, because my mother wrote back with a line about how this was petty bookkeeping and I needed to show grace, which said more about what she didn't want to admit than anything about me. My father did not reply at all, which is his way of voting with silence. Tyler answered in a single sentence that thanked me for the clarity and asked to talk after the wedding, which I respected because it sounded like a man who had just realized the ground under his feet was different than he'd been told, and Emily, of course, called me immediately and went for a new angle, accusing me of making her look bad by looping everyone in. As if the issue were optics and not the much bigger fact that she had built a plan on money that was not hers, and then acted shocked when the owner of that money stepped away. Here is the part that will not win me any prizes for saintliness, but felt like the first real act of self-respect I had taken in a long time. I told her I would not argue on the phone and that she was free to share whatever version she liked, but that the ledger and the emails would sit quietly in everyone's inboxes like a record of what had actually happened, and then I hung up and put my phone on Do Not Disturb. Not out of spite, but out of a determination to protect the first calm I had felt since the day her message landed about there being no room for me. I poured myself more coffee and opened my laptop, and, because I know how quickly people try to rewrite timelines when the consequences arrive, I logged into my accounts and downloaded clean confirmation letters for every cancellation and removal I had executed, saving them into a single folder with names simple enough that a stranger could follow the sequence. It was not meant for court or drama. It was accountability mostly for me, a way to remind myself that I had acted cleanly and with notice, and that any chaos happening now was the cost of someone else's choices coming due. Kelsey kept sending me updates I did not ask for but appreciated, like the text from the bridesmaid group where Emily floated the idea of moving the ceremony to a backyard and calling it intimate, which earned a handful of polite hearts and not much else. And another message where Emily asked if anyone had a contact who could unlock a phone plan without a deposit because hers required one now, which made me stare at the ceiling for a second and breathe through the old urge to fix and soften and pad the landing. I let the phone buzz on the table while I replied to work emails and moved an afternoon meeting, and I thought about all the weekends I had spent untangling her messes, the times I sold it to myself as love or duty, and how many of those hours could have been invested in my own life if I had been as faithful to my own goals as I was to bailing out hers. That thought hurt in a clean way, like pulling out a splinter you have ignored for too long, and it steadied me. By late afternoon, the predictable pattern had run its course, and she sent a final message that read like a white flag disguised as a warning, telling me the venue would release the date at noon if the payment didn't land, and that the only person who could fix this quickly was me, which I let sit on read because I had nothing left to explain. I made dinner, I answered 2 more emails, and when my phone vibrated again it was a new number I did not recognize. A direct line from the venue manager who introduced herself calmly and asked if I was the cardholder who had booked the initial deposit for Emily and Tyler's event, which froze me in place, because I had forgotten that the first deposit, way back when the excitement was fresh and before the invitation issue, had gone through my account to speed things up, and for a second I stared at the wall and felt the old trap snap shut, and I heard the woman say that because the original deposit came from me, my name was still on the account. Notes, and if I wished I could authorize the final payment over the phone. The venue manager was polite in that careful way people learn when they have watched too many families melt down over invoices and seating charts, and she explained, step by step, that because the first deposit had been made on my card months ago when Emily was dragging her feet and I wanted to help them lock the date, my name populated the account notes as the financial contact, which meant they were calling me as a courtesy before the noon deadline to see if I wanted to authorize the final payment or remove my card from the file entirely, and I stood in my kitchen with the phone on speaker and felt that old reflex, the one that says rescue first, negotiate later, lift its head, and then I told it to sit down, because I was done paying for access to a life I had been told I was not welcome to attend. I asked the practical questions because practical questions are oxygen when emotions are trying to choke out your better judgment. If I declined to authorize, what happened to the booking? If I removed my card, could the couple still pay by the deadline without my involvement? If the deadline passed, what occurred with the deposit? And the manager, who I liked immediately for her clean answers, said that if I did not authorize and the couple did not replace the payment by noon, the date would be released per the contract, that my card could be removed right now and the couple could still pay from their own account if they got in front of it, and that the deposit was non-refundable but could be held as a credit under the original cardholder for a future event at the venue if the booking lapsed, which meant I was not faced with a cruel choice, I was faced with a clear one. And for once the clear choice benefited me. I told her to remove my card immediately and to note on the account that I was not authorizing any additional charges now or in the future, and she did it while we were on the phone, cheerful and calm, and then she asked, almost apologetically, if I wanted to assign the deposit credit to my name in case the booking lapsed, because otherwise it would simply sit there attached to a dead reservation number, and I said yes, please put it under my name and email me the confirmation letter, and when I hung up I realized my hands were not shaking, which is how I knew I had finally stepped out of a role I never agreed to play. 2 minutes later, Emily called, and I let it go to voicemail because nothing good has ever been said to me in a panicked tone with a clock ticking in the background. And then she texted in a rush that the venue had called her to say the financial contact had declined to authorize, and did I seriously just take away her wedding? And I typed back slowly that I had not taken anything, that I had simply removed my card from a bill I was not responsible for, and that the venue had confirmed they would accept payment from her or Tyler before noon if they managed it, and I ended with a line that felt like pulling a thorn from my own hand. You told me there was no room for me, so I assumed there was no room for my money either. And she replied with a string of accusations so long and wild that I set the phone down and let the words load without reading them, because I was not going to be dragged into a loop where my refusal to be used was framed as cruelty. Tyler called next, and I did answer him because his messages, even when I did not like them, had been straightforward, and he was breathless in that way people sound when they are sprinting while pretending they are walking. And he said he was at the bank trying to wire the balance, and he requested the invoice number and any notes from the venue, and he asked if I would please not do anything else that could complicate things, and I told him I had done the opposite of complicate. I had removed myself from a ledger I never should have been on, and he went quiet and then said, in a voice that sounded tired rather than angry, that he wished Emily had told him the full story months ago, and that he did not like learning the shape of the ground while his feet were on fire. I sent him the contact email for the venue and wished him luck, and I meant it, because my boundary was not about punishing him, it was about finally acknowledging the reality Emily had forced on us both. Noon came and went with no fireworks at my house, just an email at 12:07 that the booking had lapsed and the date was released, and a separate email, clean and neutral, confirming that the deposit was now sitting as a credit in my name for future use, which I read twice before I understood what it actually meant in my life. A weekend party I could throw for people who had stood in the hard parts with me, an anniversary dinner for our parents if they ever wanted to sit at a table, without pretending we were all fine, or, if I felt petty and brave, a quiet celebration for myself where no one called me dramatic for paying my bills on time. The fallout arrived by stages, the way thunder does after lightning, with Emily first, who wrote that I had humiliated her and that Tyler's parents were furious and that I must be proud of myself for ruining her day. And I typed back carefully that I had ruined nothing, that her day had been built on a card that did not belong to her and a story that erased me while spending me, and that the only thing I was proud of was stepping out before I resented her for 10 more years. Then my parents, who split cleanly into their usual roles, my mother scolding me for being petty and my father saying nothing, which I've decided is his version of permission even if he won't say it out loud, and finally Kelsey, who sent me a picture of a bare backyard with folding chairs and a caption that said they had pivoted to a small ceremony with snacks from a warehouse club and a borrowed speaker. And I stared at it for a long minute and felt that strange combination of sadness and relief that comes when a story stops pretending to be something grand and becomes exactly what it is. Weeks later, when the noise had settled into a low hum, Emily called in a voice I barely recognized and said she wanted to talk about getting on top of her credit card debt because it was eating her alive, and I listened. Because I am not a monster and I know what it feels like to be underwater, and then I told her the truth I should have told her years ago, which is that I am not in a position to fund her life and I am done managing consequences I did not create. But if she wanted a budget template and the number of a counselor who helped me after my own bad years, I would send both, and she scoffed that I was being condescending and hung up, and I let her, because the difference now is that I did not chase after the call to soften my answer. I used the venue credit in a way that made exactly one person mad and several people quietly grateful. I booked a small dinner months out, nothing flashy, and invited my parents and 2 friends who had talked me through the worst of the spiral. And I told them there was no occasion except that I wanted a night where I was not the fixer or the backstop, and my mother almost didn't come and then did, and she left early but hugged me hard, and my father stayed to the end and asked careful questions about interest rates and autopays like he was learning me for the first time, and I went home feeling something I had not felt in years, which was that I could build a life that wasn't constantly patched around someone else's holes. People ask if I regret it, which is their polite way of asking if I went too far, and I tell them the same thing every time, that I did not swing an axe, I just stopped holding a beam, and the house that fell was not mine, and if that sounds cold. Maybe that is because it took me too long to realize that love is not the same as financing and boundaries are only real when you enforce them. And if Emily ever decides to treat me like a sister instead of a service, my door is not locked, but until. Then the message stands. She said there was no room for me, and I believed her, and I finally stopped paying the cover charge for a place that told me I wasn't on the list. And if there is any justice in that, it is the clean kind, not cruel. Not flashy. Just a woman noticing that the last piece on the board is hers and choosing, calmly, to keep it.